Hello and welcome to Console Cowboys. So in the last video, we did a quick overview of what this code is, and now we're going to deep dive into actually coding it and explain everything line by line for those that are new to Python and wouldn't quite grasp the quick overview and want to know how to actually create these projects themselves. So you'll notice here that I have three files. I have the monitor address changes.py, which is where we're going to write our code. And I have a blank text file I named attackersaddress.txt and a blank CSV file I named attackersaddress.csv. So with that, we can get coding. So let's go back into our monitor address changes. And what we're going to do is we're going to talk about what we actually want to do in this file first. Our objectives are, first, we want to request the obfuscated code in the attacker's file. We want to parse that out, grab the attacker's address from that code, update our running list of attacker addresses, and then we want to log out all the new attacker addresses to disk along with the time and the date. Then we need to set up some kind of timing interval so we're not constantly rapidly requesting this file. We'll just do it on an interval, say 5 or 10 minutes. So let's get started on that first objective, which is request the attacker's obfuscated code. Now, this was on a web page, so we need to make an HTTP request, and we can do that in Python with a library called requests, but we need to actually import it. So we'll say import requests, and this is part of the Python standard library, I believe, which is why we don't really need to install anything. So I like to use stuff from standard library because third-party code a lot is unmaintained, and then it starts breaking my programs and I have to go fix them. But if I use a lot of the standard library code, it tends to work longer. So let's make a request and we'll put that to a variable so we can use the response data from the variable later on to parse out the actual address. So we'll make a variable called response, and we'll make that equal to the request to the web page. So we say requests dot get, and all we have to do is in brackets put our URL, and this is the URL from the malware page on the previous blog. Now, once we do that, we want to see and make sure we're getting something back. So let's first say data equals response.text. So we're going to change this response object into a text that we can actually manipulate or parse. And let's print that out to make sure it's actually working. So we'll say print. And we can say data. And now once we print this out, we should see the contents of the page. So all we did here was import requests, get a response object from the URL that we're calling with requests. Then we save that response object to text and we're printing it out. Pretty easy peasy, and that will make our first objective completed. So let's hit up the terminal here. I'm going to save this and I'm going to say Python 3 and the name of the file, which is the monitor address changes. And we should get back all of the page data. So here's all the page data. Now, the second objective is to parse out the attacker's address from that code. In order to do that, we're going to need to do a regex. So we're going to import RE. And with the RE, we need to know what we're looking for. So if we actually look at the web page, we'll see that there's a text of return with a space after it. And then we have 0x and a whole bunch of alphanumerics followed by a semicolon. So we need everything in between that semicolon and that return space. So what we're going to do is create a little regex and parse that out exactly. And I'll explain exactly what I'm doing. So we have our data, which is our text of our response, and we are going to parse that by saying attackers address will be our variable that we're going to put the address into when it's found, and we'll say re.search. So we're going to use the regex search, and we'll say r, and then we need to put our regex within these quotes. It's going to be very simple. Return, and then space, and then we're going to put dot, which means look for everything, star, question mark, which means be really greedy, and then we want to grab up to the semicolon, right? So what this is saying is we're going to look for that pattern of return space. We're going to grab everything in between it, and we're going to end at the semicolon. And if we take a look at the regular expressions here, this is the definitions for the regular expressions, regular expression operators. And we look at the dot. It says dot is the default mode. This matches any character except for a new line. So that pretty much covers what we're looking for. And then we want to follow that up by the star plus question mark qualifiers are greedy. They match as much text as possible. So we want to match as much text as possible after this return space up until we hit this semicolon. Pretty simple regex. I mean, you can get super complicated. And if you're looking to get into a lot of regex stuff, I believe it's Black Hills Information Security. They're what is it, Wild Wild Hacking Fest trainings. They have one that is a recorded one that you can watch of, I believe it's My Life is Regular Expressions or something. Really good one. It's like 3 hours long. It will give you a lot of good info on creating more complicated regular expressions. If this is new to you, check out that and let them know I sent you over there. So let's see. Now what we need to do is we need to say we're getting this from the data variable, right? So we're going to search within this data variable, which is the text of our web page. And then we want to grab group one. And what that should be, if I understand this correctly, is we have group 0, which would be this return space, followed by group 1, which would be the address we want to parse out, and then the semicolon. So we're going to be grabbing group 1 and putting it as the attacker's address. And now, if that worked, we should have parsed out the attacker's address from that big lump of data. So we want to check that out, though, by actually printing it out and making sure. So we want to iteratively check out all of the code we write to make sure each piece is working before we move to the next one. So attacker's address, and we can just print that out. We're going to save it, and we're just going to run this thing again. And this time, we should get nothing but the attacker's address. And that did work. So it looks like it might have updated 85F, which may be a new one here. So we got 27. If we refresh here, yep, looks like the attacker's using a new address already, which means that's logged into my already running program you saw in the last video. So that was actually good timing on that part. So now that we parsed that out, we actually solved the second part here. So we can just, for reference, put these above. That way we know which ones we already did. So this is parsing out this. And next up, what did we have? Update our running list of attackers' addresses. So in order to do that, we need an actual running list to begin with. Now, the running list is initially going to come from running this and then logging it to the file. But if you restart this, it's also coming from the file. So what we need to do is we need to pull in the contents of this attacker's address.txt, which is currently empty. And then once we do that, what we're going to do is check that this new address that we got is not in that file and not in the variable we create from that file. And if it's not, we're going to add it to it. If it is, we're just going to move on. So the way that we're going to do that is we're going to pull in everything in this file. So we could say 1, 2, 3. We're going to pull in 1, 2, 3, which would be the attacker's addresses, as a list. So let's create a global variable as a list. And we're going to say attacker's list, which is going to be our list variable. And what we want to do is we want to grab each line of it, but we want to strip off new lines because when we log it, we're going to log it with new lines, so everything's on a new line. So we'll say line.rstrip, which strips those off. And where are we going to get that line from? From a for loop iterating over the lines of the file. So we'll say for line in our file. So we'll open up this file and we'll say attackers output. And the reason we can do that is because we're in the directory with the attacker's output.txt. So that's where it looks by default. Now, that should be good to go, other than we misspelled something here. Okay, so that gets rid of that. So now we should have an attackers list that comes from this file. So if we import this right now and we print it out, we should see 1, 2, and 3. So let's actually print that out as well. So we'll print, and then you'll be able to see what a list looks like as well if you're new to Python. Attackers list. And this should print out a comma-separated list of 1, 2, and 3, and then print out our attacker's address. So we'll say, run this again. And we got an error, no such thing as attackers output.text. So let's make sure that we did this correct here. Attackers output.text. Oh, that's not what we named it. That we actually named that attackers address.text. So I'm sure somebody's screaming at me, hey, what are you doing? While I was typing that, but that's a quick fix there. You always got to look at your errors. They'll tell you what you did wrong. So now you see we have our list here, 1, 2, and 3. And then we'll write code that checks this list to make sure that this address is not already in there. If it isn't in there, it's going to add it to it. So what we can do right now is, for testing purposes, we will grab this address because we don't want to use just 1, 2, 3. And we're going to dump something into this list for testing purposes. And we'll just change something at the end so it's different. And now let's write some code that decides whether it's going to append to this list and then write to log files, etc. So what we are going to say now is if attacker's address not in attacker's list. See, pretty straightforward. It's almost like reading English. If the attacker's address is not in the attacker's list, then we're going to say attackers list.append because we're going to append that value into it. Attacker address, right? So pretty simple. It almost reads like English if you're new to Python, right? If the attacker's address is not in the attacker's list, then the attacker's list is going to be appending the attacker's address to that list, so now it does exist, right? And then right after that, that's when we're going to want to start logging things. But let's actually see if that works, because what we're going to do is we're going to run this again, and we have a fake attacker's address in there. We change the value. So after this runs, since it's not in the list, we should see both of those within our list here if we print it out, right? So let's run this again. So now we see two values in here. We see the 085F and then 085F, but this one ends in 6 and this one ends in 5 because there's a new one. Now, if we run this again though, it's not going to append it again because this if statement is going to fail, right? It's going to say attacker's address not in attacker's list, but that's untrue because we just added it. It does exist there now. So if we run it again, we should get the same results and there should be no updates to that file, right? So now we just have these two things in here. It's not going to update again. So that's working as intended. And now the next thing that we're going to want to do is we're going to want to start writing the addresses to the file instead of just, adding them in here ourselves. So because you'll notice we only have the one in there, it added it to our list, but not to our file. So now we need to add it to the file as well. So we can do that with a with statement. So we'll say with open attackers address.text. And we want to open this in append mode because if we open it with read or write, it will write over the file. So we want to append to the file. And we'll say as writer, because that's the variable we're going to use to actually interact with this file now that it's open. And we'll say writer.write because we want to write with the writer to the file. And then we want to write what? The attacker's address that we just grabbed, right? Attacker's address. And we want to add a new line when we do it, so they're each on a new line. So a new line in programming is usually that /n, and that will create a new line each time that it appends this. So now when we run this, what we want to do is we'll delete this out of here. And what you'll see when we run this is that this time it'll actually append it there for us when we run it. So let's leave that open so you can see that happen. And you'll see now there's one attacker's address in here. And then there is the output of the attacker's address. And then we have the attacker's address that was automatically logged in here. So that's working as well. But we also have this attacker's address.csv. And what we wanted to do with this was we wanted to add the attacker's address plus the current timestamp. So let's rearrange this code really quick so that we have the things here. So we're going to update our running list of attackers. So let's cut this and put that above there so we just know we're getting through our list here. So we'll say that's doing that there. And then we want to log the attacker's addresses to disk with the time and the date. But here's the thing with that, right? So let's clean up this code a little bit first before we do that. And what we want to do is we want to start making this into a function now because we're doing multiple things, right? We're making some HTTP requests and then we're parsing those and then we're starting to log things and check things. So let's instead create a check addresses function that pulls down the file and then parses it out. And let's handle writing and logging and all of that stuff in another function. So let's say we're going to do define check addresses. And that's how you do a function in Python. And then also in Python, you need to indent, right? So everything we want in this file, we need to indent underneath that check addresses, right? So I'm going to kill this here. So that cleans that up a bit. So in here in the check addresses, we want to grab the response, turn it into text, and then we want to parse it out. And then we want to add it to, we want to update our attackers list, but we probably don't want to actually start writing. We're going to put that in a separate function. So let's create a separate function over here, and we will call this one write address. We'll say define write address. And with this one, we actually need to put the stuff that we want to write. So we want to write the attacker's address to start, right? So I'm going to set up the indenting like that. And the indenting in Python is generally 5 spaces. I have my tab set up to 5 spaces, so I can just hit tab. It's a bit more convenient. You can do that in almost all of the text editors. So now that we have that set up, we have a function and we have all of the stuff in there that we're doing. So we need to, after we decide, okay, this is a new address, we need to write that new address. So right in here, we're just going to call our write address function. So we'll say write address, and we'll say attacker's address. And that will send over the attacker's address to that function. And then in order to initially call this check addresses, we actually need to call that now, right? Before it just ran it because it was default in the file, but now it's in a function, and functions are only accessed when you call them. So we'll say check addresses. So that will call that if you're new to Python. And once that's called, it will run all of this code up until we get to this write address, which will call the write address function with the attacker's address and will still log it. So all the functionality is exactly the same, but now we're able to call each of these functions separately in case later on we're using the same functionality somewhere else. We can call it here instead of having to rewrite it, right? And that's just the point of functions, just so you have functions you can call every time you need that specific data back or that specific functionality utilized. So this should function exactly the same way that we just used it, but we should double check that before moving on. So we'll say new terminal, and let's blank this out again so that way we get new data in here. And I'm going to go back. We'll make sure this is actually working. So we'll say, no, we don't want to ping google.com. We want to say Python 3 monitor. And we have : expected, right? So whenever we have a function, we need to end with a semicolon, and then we need to indent after that. See right there, we have that little red line. We just forgot this one. Boom, because those are important, right? So after if statements and after functions, it always ends in the semicolon, and then whatever's after that semicolon gets indented in Python. So let's do that again. Open that so you can see it, and we'll say Python 3, monitor addresses, attacker's address is not defined on line 26, so we misspelled something here. Attacker's address, and that is because those are within these functions now and the namespaces, right? So here's how namespaces work. Everything you define within this function is within this function's namespace, and if we create variables in here, they're not going to be seen out here. This attacker's list can be seen everywhere because it's, you know, outside of the function, it's in a global namespace and everybody can access it. But everything created in here can't, right? So we created this attacker's address within this function. So we need to actually call it within that function or return it, either one. So what we can do is we can grab this and we can paste this right inside this function just to make sure it's working. And we should have access to the attacker's address in here because we passed it in here, and we should have attacker's list because it's global. So now this should function. Python 3, monitor. And there you go. So we have our list again. It's pulling in from our file, and then here is the address we're printing out. And it should also be in here, and it is. So that's perfect. So now that we have that, we now need to start logging the time as well to this one. So we can do that right within our write function that we just created. With open, and actually we could just copy paste this and then change it, and that'll be easier. And what we'll say is attacker address dot CSV, and we're also going to open that with the append mode as writer, writer.write. This time we're going to do the attacker address plus we're going to do a comma because it's a comma separated list, CSV, plus we're going to do the time, right? So we're going to do something that we send in, so we'll just say it's going to be time updated, and we're going to create that variable in a second. And then we're going to put the new line after that, so we have a new line. But we need to create this time updated variable with the current time, and we can do that pretty easy. So let's just create that right here under our data variable, and we'll say time updated, and that's going to be our now, but we need to create that now first. So we're going to say from date time import date time, and date time is just a standard library. We can grab the time and date, and we're going to grab that with now equals date time dot now, and that literally is just grabbing the current time, and that's our date object. But kind of like our response object, we need a text implementation or a string version of it in order to log it. It won't let us log the actual object. So this is what we're going to do with this time updated. We're going to get the string representation that we can actually log. And the way that we're going to do that is we're going to say our now variable dot strf time, and then we're going to paste in a format string for that. So I'm going to copy paste that in, and then I'll explain what it is. It's super simple as soon as I explain it, but I'll screw it up if I type it for sure. So all this is pretty simple. M for month, D for day, Y for year, and it's H for hour, M for minute, and S for second. So you're basically grabbing the date and the time from that date time object by referencing the format strings it understands, and you're turning it into a string with strf time. So now we have a string representation of the month, day, year, hour, minute, seconds that we can log along with our attacker's address. So now that we have that, that's created at the same time that we grab that GitHub link, we can pass that into our write address function, right? So we can say time updated, and then we can also pass that in here and say time updated. Perfect. Okay, that should all be set up. I'm gonna make sure I spelled these things correctly. I always screw it up. So we have now a time updated. We have the attacker's address, and then we're going to pass both of those into this function, and we're going to log attacker's address into this file. We're going to log the attacker's address, comma, with the timestamp into this file so that we can later on do some graphing or do some data analysis based on how often the attacker is actually changing their address, and then analyze the transactions with that as well. So this technically should work now, although I'm getting one error here. It says time updated is not defined. Let me make sure this is the same here. Should be good. Plus time updated. Okay, weird. Let's see if it actually just works. Invalid syntax. Oh, it's because I have a dot after it. It looks like that would be why, instead of putting a comma. Perfect. I knew there was something wrong there. And let's actually delete this out of here, because otherwise our code will not run, because it will say, oh, this address is already in here. So we want both of these actually build a log here. So we'll say go. And then we have some kind of error. What do we got here? strf time has no attribute. Built-in function or method has no attribute. strf time. So let's double check what we put there. Oh, I know what we did there. We actually forgot to finish this. So that's why this strf time didn't exist on now, because it wasn't properly creating that object. So that should fix that problem. We should be good now, I would assume, but let's give it a shot. All right, so it looks like we're logging here again, we're logging here again. So our first file should have the same thing as before. Our list has that as well. And now we have the attacker's address.csv, which has our thing there, and then it has our date. So we are perfect, and that should all be working. So that's good. Excellent. So that should meet most of our objectives. We have our request the attacker's obfuscated code, parse out the attacker's address from the code. Then we're updating our running list of attacker addresses. We're logging the attacker address to disk with the time and the date. So that's perfect. We created those two functions to do those things. And now that this is a more comprehensive program, let's create a main function that kicks everything off and handles the loop that keeps running. Now in Python, you can have it automatically call a function at start with something called underscore underscore name underscore underscore equals equals underscore underscore main underscore underscore, and then in there you call whatever function you want to call, which we will actually call the main function. So we have to define that main function now, and we'll call this main, which is what it's calling right here, and we need that semicolon after there, or actually colon. We'll say while true. So we want to do a while loop. So there's for loops and while loop in programming. We'll do a lot of those as we're coding. But we're just doing a while loop here, and we're saying while true, which means this is an infinite loop. It's never ever going to stop. It's basically what you're not supposed to do in programming, but we're going to do it because we never want it to stop. And we're going to say we want to call the check addresses, because that is what we were doing right up here, or right down here. So actually we copy paste that in here. Won't need it down there anymore. When this application gets executed, it's going to see this, and then it's going to call main, and inside main it's going to start a loop. And inside this loop, it's going to never end, and it's going to keep calling check addresses. But we don't want it to call it continuously rapid speed, because these addresses are only changing every few hours, every day, etc. So we need to put a timer on there. So let's put a short timer right first so we can make sure that time is working. And the way that we do that is by importing the time functionality. So we have date time, but we need actual timing functionality, which we can do with time. So once we have time in here, and that's just another standard library functionality, we can say, after you run check addresses, let's wait another 3 seconds. So we'll say time.sleep, and it will sleep this program for 3 seconds. And let's check if that's working by just printing something after. So print, and we'll say tick tock. So every 3 seconds, we are going to print tick tock. And that will just give us the indication that our timer's working and we're not just going rapid fire. So now if we run this, it should run everything like normal. It'll run the check addresses first, and then we're just gonna see tick tock. It'll run it again and again and again. It's not gonna keep appending this to here though, because we have that check to check if that is already in the list. So we shouldn't really see any printouts, but let's see the first printout just so we know that everything's functioning properly. Save that. And we'll delete this out of here. Okay, perfect. So let's run this, and we should see that tick tock every 3 seconds, and we should see those addresses added like they were before. Python 3 monitor. All right, so we see our addresses and tick tock 1, 2, 3. Tick tock 1, 2, 3. Tick tock. Okay, so that timer is working. Control C out of there, and this address is, yep, still logging, so we're still good there. So now what we want to do is we just want to calculate, okay, well, if this is going by seconds, there are 60 seconds in a minute. So if we want to do it every 5 minutes, it's going to be 6 times 5 is 30, so it's going to be 300. So we'll just say do this every 300 seconds, right? And this is basically all we need to do now, and we're done. I mean, we can put some niceties in here. So like when we write a new attacker's address, right, we're adding it to the attacker list. We should probably log that that's happening instead of just, what were we doing before? Where's our print statements? Print. So we're printing the attacker's address here, and we're printing the attacker's list. We don't need to print the attacker's list. That's unneeded. And now what we're gonna do is where we are putting it into our list up here, we're just going to say print attacker's address, but we'll put some actual text in there too. So we'll use an F string. So an F string in Python allows us to put variables inside of quotes, just putting them in brackets. So we put an F and then the quote, and we'll end quote this. Now, if we put this variable, normally it would just print attacker's address, but if we put this within brackets, it will then realize it's a variable and, you know, call the value in that variable and print it instead. So we can say added new address colon attacker's address, and then we have that. If we want to do the time with it, we could say at, and then just put that timing variable we had. So that would be this time updated. And now when it logs it, it should give us a nice display so we can keep a look and, you know, like look at it every once in a while and know that it's actually working. And let's break these out of here again and make sure that it's good to go. Okay, so if we run this now, we should get this printout, and it should continually run. And we shouldn't really need to do anything else. This is basically done. So we'll say terminal. All right, so add a new address, and then it said at that time. And then every time that the attacker changes the address now, within the 5-minute interval that we're looking at, it will add a new one on there, and it'll keep adding that on there. And this attacker address will keep adding that on there. But the only thing we didn't verify is we didn't verify it will add a new address and a new attacker address to both of these after that. So we should probably do that just to be sure, because I like to make sure that everything is actually functioning. So we'll say change this again, And we'll leave these both in there and we'll run it again and we'll just make sure that it adds both of them on there. Cool. So I added that and we have both with the new line. Perfect. Both with a new line. So this is done now, and all this is doing is this is just allowing us to monitor whenever the attacker is changing these addresses. Now we can start cataloging all the addresses that the attacker is using. And then once we get a long list of those, maybe we'll see them start wrapping like he's reusing addresses, or maybe he'll just keep creating more, but then we can start seeing the balances of those addresses, the amount of money going to each of those contracts, maybe before he changes those addresses, and then where he's sending all of the funds out of those addresses to, and we can start looking a little deeper. So let's run this for like maybe a week, and then let's come back and then let's start analyzing other things involving all the addresses that we are collecting. So hopefully you guys learned something, and hopefully this was really good for new Python programmers to see like how to put something together like this. It was pretty simple. All we're really doing is parsing out something and then logging, but there's a lot there as far as Python programming goes, because we interacted with files, we interacted with the web, we did regex parsing, we worked with lists, we worked with all kinds of stuff, timing. So hopefully you got a lot out of this. If you did, please like and share it and give me some feedback. Thank you.